A warning. This episode contains graphic descriptions of a mass casualty event. Please listen with care.
A listener production.
Saturday, October 12th, 2002. A warm night in Bali's bustling Kuta Beach. Bars packed with tourists, music pumping. Then, devastation. Two massive explosions rip through popular Paddy's bar and the Sari Club across the road. 202 lives were lost, 88 of them Australians. In the wreckage, tiny clues told a story. Copper wires, microscopic fragments of tartan fabric, the surprising absence of a crater. Australian Federal Police forensic chemist David Royds arrived at the scene just 48 hours later. Sifting through the devastation, he began working out what had happened and how it had happened, thereby uncovering essential information that would eventually lead to the arrest of the bombers. Today, he takes us inside the science of that investigation and reveals the lessons learned from it. My name's Liz Porter. I'm a journalist, true crime author and forensic science obsessive. I've spent my career uncovering how forensic science cracks the toughest cases, writing 3 books on the subject and earning a PhD in the history of the Victoria Police Forensic Science Lab. Join me as I sit down with the world's top forensic experts and discover how forensic science is convicting the guilty and exonerating the innocent.
I was always interested in forensic science. It goes back to childhood memories of growing up on a property during terrible drought times and seeing a lot of dead animals and death. I went to university. I joined the New South Wales Police after going to university, and once when I joined the New South Wales Police, I gravitated into their scientific investigation section, and that was basically a crime scene unit working out of Sydney central area. And then after a little while, I moved to Orange in central New South Wales, and I was working as a regional crime scene examiner there for about 8 years. And that's when I had the good fortune of doing a lot of community service, but as a result of that, I got a Rotary scholarship to study forensic chemistry in Scotland, which I did. And I came back to Australia thinking that I'd probably do a training role in the New South Wales Police, but then it was just difficult to move in the organisation, and end up getting a job with the Australian Federal Police as a forensic chemist, which was a pretty, significant learning curve for me after that point. So I went from being, the crime scene examiner taking samples to the laboratory to being the analyst behind the laboratory, analysing the samples and telling police basically what was the potential evidence in their samples.
So by the time the Bali bombing happened in late 2002, you'd been with the AFP for 3 years. You were obviously an automatic choice to go. Can you tell us how you got the call?
I remember my wife rang me and said there's something gone really bad in Indonesia and a lot of Australians have been killed. And I ended up just getting a phone call from my boss saying, get ready to go. So I did.
And so fairly soon you found yourself on a plane to Bali. Can you tell us a little bit about the plane journey over and who was there?
Yes, I was deployed to Bali with a small group of crime scene examiners on the 15th of October 2002. And my role there was as a forensic chemist to set up this portable laboratory. But, we had never done overseas deployment before. We're all hyped up. And we're on this plane that was empty. It was a Mercy flight provided by Qantas. And I remember the stewardess coming down and saying, can you tone it down, please, because there's relatives of the families up front. And suddenly it hit me. I thought, my God, there's people, just seats ahead of me that were going over to look for their children. It's sort of suddenly very, very sobering experience, very sobering moment.
When you arrived in Bali, was it all very smooth, or were there a few glitches?
Oh, look, when we arrived there, it was chaotic. We were eventually taken to a hotel. It was hot, it was steamy, and we arrived there, and the AFP police officers were setting up a forward command post, and they were working really, with purpose, but with an air of sort of concern about them. And it was chaotic at one stage there. Somebody said we're going to move to some other hotel, and one of my commanders said, no, we need to have our forensic people nearby. And, so there's so much uncertainty and just jumping here and jumping there and moving around and so forth. But eventually we ended up setting up, moving into the same hotel. There was a police forward command post, and that was a very, very good thing.
And you brought with you the contents of your mobile laboratory?
Yes, the first arrival, we brought a few instruments, which are just microscopes and basically, detection instruments that we use, the kind of things you see at the airport, for detecting explosives, the ion scans and things like that. We took them there, and, setting up a laboratory is more than instruments. It's actually about procedures, because you need to put in procedures to prevent or minimise the risk of contamination. So even using a motel room is a challenge. Like, you've got to make sure the cleaner doesn't come in during the night and clean it. So you have to get a motel room that has a lockable door, and, you clean it thoroughly before you set your instruments up. And then when you set your instruments up, you need to do that all on fresh, clean paper. And just getting these things is difficult. And then after you set everything up, you need to swab absolutely everything to make sure that it's not, that the previous residents in the room may not have, made sure they didn't have explosives or anything like that on them. It was just a really, really tedious chore of a job. In fact, one of the hotels, at one stage, in one of our later deployments, we stayed in a rather plush hotel, and we chose to use the bathroom because the bathroom was all marble lined. You could actually wash the walls and wash the floor and get the place really, really clean and have confidence that it wasn't contaminated.
Once you'd settled in, I gather you then went to the scene. What greeted you there?
Well, early next morning, I made my first foray into the nightclub district, and it was weird. It was spooky. It was quiet. It was hot. It was steamy. But there were people milling around the place, and a lot of people, I think, were in a state of shock. There was this sort of sweet smell in the air of basically fire and damage, and really, it was huge. It was a huge crime scene. There were streets there which are really tightly packed with cars which are all burnt out. Trying to make sense of all this was just really, really difficult. But that was my first foray into the nightclub district. And then after that, we had briefings, and it was told to us very clearly that our job was to, just help the Indonesian police if asked, and that we were to examine scenes after they had finished with them. One of the interesting things about forensic science is that we work on the gift principle, which is get it first time. And secondly, when you work at a scene, you work from the outside in. Now, the natural thought of most people is to work from the inside out, because that's where all the main crater is. But when you think about crime scenes, well, if you think about bombs, for example, the smaller the bomb, the greater the potential evidence, because the bomb that's going to have the most evidence you'll ever come across is an unexploded bomb, because it'll have fingerprints and DNA and everything else in it. So if you have a very small bomb that's gone off, you've got much, much better chance of recovering trace evidence from that than if you go to the really big bomb. Now, with that first Bali bombing in Paddy's bar, and it was relatively undamaged, like the building had been burnt upstairs, but downstairs hadn't. and that's where the bomb went off. And that had a lot of potential evidence in it. The second one outside the Sari Club was this massive, great big bomb. Left a hole in the ground, 1.5 metres across and probably 1 metre deep and full of water. And, of course, the third bombing was what they call a signature bombing, which happened outside the US Embassy or near the Australian US Embassy district in Renon. We were told it was just firecrackers had gone off on the side of the road, but as soon as we saw it, we knew it wasn't. And that was rich in evidence.
And that bomb, I gather, was there to send a message.
Yeah, that's what we presume. I think it was meant to be delivered to the actual embassy, but I think the offenders dropped it off before they actually got there and left. And it sort of knocked a curbstone out of the ground and turned it into sand. But I don't think it killed anybody at all. It was just an explosion. But interestingly, one of the traits of high explosives such as TNT is that they have a property called brisance, and brisance is a shattering effect. So if you put a high explosive onto a concrete bollard, you'll shatter it and turn it into beach sand, and that's exactly what we saw at Renon. So as soon as we saw that the concrete curbstone had been shattered, we knew that we're talking about high explosives. And of course, it's quite easy to get a sample from that site and analyse it, and we recovered TNT from that.
David, can you tell me about that first day for you at the Paddy's Bar crime scene? You arrived and officially you weren't supposed to be working there yet.
Yes, that's right. We weren't supposed to be there at the time, but I stepped over a barrier tape and a Indonesian police officer didn't have any objections with me going in, so I did. And I walked in there and I could see that the floor inside Paddy's Bar looked like a mosh pit. It was just an absolute mess, the shoes and lipstick and all sorts of stuff, it was just an absolute mess. But whilst I was looking at the floor, I saw 2 pieces of copper wire. Now, this was relevant because electronics usually use multi-strand wire to, reduce impedance in electronic signals, but detonators use monocore copper wire. So I recognised this as out of context. And also the wire was distorted, the insulation was heat damaged, and it's all bent. There are 2 little sections about, 2 or 3 centimetres long. But I recognised them to be leg wires to a detonator. So what I did is I just folded up a piece of paper and slipped them into my top pocket of my overalls. And just in the chaos of everything, I just forgot about them, basically, at that point in time. Anyway, I started continuing to look around the Paddy's Bar, and then eventually I looked up. And when I looked up, I could see that the moment in time when the bomb had gone off had been actually captured in the form of blood spatter on the ceiling. And it was the whole story was up there. It just needed to be interpreted, which took a little while, but I climbed up and collected samples off that ceiling. There was connective tissues, human blood and all that sort of, all the awful stuff. But there was also quite a lot of grey soot. And that grey soot is a telltale sign of TNT. So I scraped some of those samples up and took them back to our laboratory for further analysis. We were then, told to leave the Paddy's Bar and wait for the Indonesians to finish doing their examination, which they did some days later. And some days later, we were then invited back into a room that had been completely swept out, cleaned out, completely tidied up, and, you wouldn't think there was any potential evidence there. But, interestingly, they had this decor where they had welded 44-gallon drums around concrete pillars to make them look like trunks of palm trees and so forth. And, of course, debris had landed at the top, ricocheted off the ceiling and gone down inside these 44-gallon drums. We cut those drums apart and found down the bottom of that small sections of tartan fabric. And that tartan fabric was extremely interesting because it was out of context. Like, who would wear tartan in Bali? So then we kept on looking for tartan fabric, and when we started finding it 360 degrees around the crater, trace amounts, just very, very small amounts, under bricks and under rubble and things. And, if something is spread around the epicenter of an explosion, and as part of, it's reasonable to assume it's part of the bomb. So it turned out that this tartan fabric, we think, being the most plausible explanation, would be that it was the lining of the suicide bomber's vest.
Now, your first clue to the significance of that tartan fabric came on that very first day at the crime scene when you picked up those 2 wires and tucked them into your overalls. Can you tell us about the fate of those 2 wires with the microscopic threads of material attached?
Yes, well, I put these 2 wires just into a paper sleeve that I put in my top pocket of my overalls. And, of course, it was so hot and so steamy over there that when I finally got back to my hotel room, I decided that, I just had to wash my clothing. So I filled up the bathroom sink and just put my overalls in there and washed them. I completely forgot about these samples that were in my pocket. Washed my overalls and hung them up to dry the best I could. And next morning, during the night, I suddenly realised, oh no, there was those samples in my pocket. So next morning, I ripped open the packet and had a close look, and sure enough, the samples had survived the washing, and I got them back to our little mobile laboratory setup and had a close look at them under a microscope, and that's when I saw the red, white, and blue cotton fibres, tiny little, not visible to the naked eye really, the tiny little fibres attached and melted into the insulation of the copper wire. That was unusual, like red, white, and blue cotton fibres, and the leg wires of the detonator had to mean something. Didn't know what at the time, but eventually, the picture became more and more clear, especially when we started recovering tartan fabric from around the epicenter there, that it was actually part of the bomb.
Again, at Paddy's bar, when you first walked in, as you mentioned before, you did make a significant discovery when you looked at the ceiling. Now, at that time, it wasn't particularly a theory that your bosses wanted to know about. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I'll just step back a little bit about that. What happened was that we knew that we were finding TNT. We knew that TNT was high explosive, that has this shattering effect. I knew that there should have been a crater. Like if the bomb had been placed on the ground, it should have left a shattered crater in the concrete, the same as we saw at Renon, and there wasn't. If the bomb had been placed on a timber table, it would have been converted into matchsticks, and there was no evidence of shattered timber there. By using just string lines, we worked out that the height of the bomb when it went off was about 1.2 metres above the ground. And really the only plausible explanation for that was that it was either carried or worn by somebody. So that was sort of probably the first very, very strong piece of evidence to indicate that suicide bombers were involved.
But that wasn't initially announced, was it? There was a press conference in which the idea of a suicide bomber was specifically hosed down by Graham Ashton, who was the head of the task force.
Yes, definitely. The situation was that the implications of a terrorist group being active in Indonesia and in a place like Bali would have had terrible economic consequences, which means basically hardship, starvation, death, basically of the local people. So for a whole range of reasons, I was told, just to keep my theories to myself because people did not want to know about it. But eventually, but like science doesn't work that way. Science, like I was over there to use the technology and the skills that I had to try to uncover what the truth was from potential evidence. And I couldn't help but blurt it out. This is the most plausible explanation. And people didn't want to know about it. But I remember going to a press conference and everybody in the room nodded, saying, yes, that's the only possible explanation or the most plausible explanation. And eventually, after a while, the evidence started coming. After weeks and weeks of tedious work, everything just kept on supporting that evidence, that theory. And eventually it was completely accepted.
The analysis of the human remains on the ceiling also pointed to a suicide bombing. Can you explain why?
Yeah, so it was really interesting because at one stage, one of the red herrings was that a bomb had been thrown through the window, rolled across the floor, and somebody had stood over it and was a victim and got sent up onto the ceiling. I was particularly interested to know how many people were in that blood spatter. So I collected many samples and sent them back to our laboratory back here in Canberra. It turned out to just be the one person. Now, at this stage, the investigation was travelling fairly quickly, and the Indonesian police had an idea who that person was. So they and the AFP sent investigators to the village where that person's parents lived and got samples of DNA from those parents to prove that it was their son who had suicided. But much to everybody's amazement, the union of those two parents did not match that son, did not match that spatter. So one of the detectives, a very clever guy, just said, look, let's search our disaster victim identification database, because we were collecting DNA samples from every possible source to try to repatriate body parts back to the relatives. And of course, the profile was actually found in amongst that database. Now, that person, there was only tiny remains of that person are left, a little bit of jawbone, I think it was, or just something very, very tiny. But suddenly that became extremely relevant because what we had was two suicides. And once when you got two suicides, then it's almost implausible to think that it's anything other than an act of terrorism.
There was a significant discovery made by Indonesian police relating to the identity of the bomber. They found a car and they found a tiny component of that car which was crucial. Can you tell us about that?
It's terribly important for police forces from different jurisdictions to work closely together. Things that are relevant to us here in Australia may not be relevant to people in Indonesia and vice versa. The Indonesians had come across parts of the vehicle chassis in the crater and on buildings around the Sari Club site. Parts where the chassis number and the engine number should have been had been ground off. In other words, the offenders were covering their tracks and used the grinder and ground off those numbers. But unbeknownst to us, the Indonesians recognised the fact that there was a little metal plate near the rear offside wheel arch. One of their Lab 4 men ground that plate off and revealed underneath a particular number, and the number started with DPR. Anyway, that number referred to a number that was put on by the Denpasar Motor Registry, and they did it to monitor the roadworthiness of vehicles that could be used to carry passengers for safety reasons. Now, unbeknownst to Amrozi, the vehicle that he bought up in Java had actually spent its earlier life down in Bali. So Amrozi had absolutely no idea that that number was on the vehicle. So this Indonesian crime scene man who found the number found key evidence. It was a brilliant piece of work. He found the evidence. He reported it to his boss. And then the detectives moved in. And I think they went back through 6 unregistered owners before they knocked on the door. I had to go to somebody and say, look, did you own this car and who did you buy it from and who did you sell it to? And they did that through 6 unregistered owners all the way back till eventually they were knocking on the door of Amrozi at his house up in Java. And Aussie apparently just said, "My gosh, you're clever people, aren't you?" Because, they traced it all the way back to him. And that was, all credit to the Indonesian police. That was a brilliant piece of detective work and excellent breakthrough for the whole case.
It was important to know the exact components of the bomb because at some future time when you have a potential location for the place where the bomb was made, you need to know what you're looking for. Now, sometime later, you came back to Denpasar to look at this suspect house. So what can you tell us?
In the meantime, Liz, we'd been actually being invited by the Indonesian police to go from house to house to house looking for potential trace evidence. And we spent a lot of time over there just searching for trace evidence where they suspected these people had stayed the night or moved on or whatever it might be. We found very little, but eventually we were told about this house in Denpasar where they alleged that the bomb had actually been put together. So I was told about this and I jumped on a flight and went straight back to Indonesia, arriving there late at night and then working through to about 11 o'clock that night and then getting up at crack of dawn next morning and working until eventually we processed that scene. And indeed, that was where the bomb had actually been put together. It was a house that had a carport, internal carport, and that's where the van had been. They had mixed their chemicals there. They'd had an accidental explosion in there, apparently. But when the bomb had gone off, they put all this explosives into 12 4-drawer plastic filing cabinets that was in the back of the van, which was a mistake for them. And then they drove it to the Sari Club where it was detonated. Now, the reason why it was a mistake for them was because when they'd loaded up these filing cabinets and then driven it about 10 kilometres, the explosive mixtures had settled with a vibration, which created air spaces between each of the drawers. So when the bomb, when it went off, it actually didn't go off as efficiently as it could have. If it was all in the one bag, it would have completely detonated, I suspect, and would have been a much, much bigger explosion. But as it turned out, because there were all these filing cabinet drawers that were full of explosive that had air gaps between them, the bomb went off like a giant 1-ton match head. And that was actually caused the bomb to be more destructive because it actually caused a terrible inferno to start. Like when you let off high explosive like TNT, rarely would you have a fire caused by it. But if you slow down the rate of the reaction, then you've got more time for thermal conductivity to occur and more time for things to catch on fire. And, this giant, great big 1-ton match head going off outside the Sari Club was enough to start the whole district to catch on fire, and that's what caused a lot of the problems.
Besides finding evidence as to the ingredients of the bomb, you also found some evidence that pointed to the bomb makers.
Yes, we found a newspaper there that had a drawing in red ink showing the 12 filing cabinets positioned in the back of the van. And that was kind of very, very interesting, to see that. But I remember actually we had this piece of paper sitting on a table, and as we walked past it, my boss suddenly recognised a shiny sheen about it, and it turned out that it was actually aluminium dust, which is one of the components of the bomb. Now, aluminium dust is also used to detect fingerprints. So with a little bit of further enhancement, oblique lighting and so forth, we actually detected a footprint, and got very excited because we're hoping we could actually do a fingerprint test between that footprint and one of the offender's feet. Turned out that there wasn't enough detail to actually identify him in traditional fingerprint sense, but certainly the foot shape was the same as Amrozi's foot. So it tied in very nicely.
Could you explain the significance of the work of the DNA analysts in identifying the perpetrators?
Initially, the pathologists were looking at bodies purely for the purpose of repatriating them back to the families. And they were not thinking along the lines of who could have been an offender or anything like that. Now, about 3 weeks down the track, what happened was that I was asked to go to the mortuary and re-examine a body or re-examine body parts with Dr. Clive Cook from Western Australia. It turned out that what we had was 2 feet and a head and nothing in between. And, these parts had been overlooked for a number of reasons. They were all put in different bags at the time. And the pathologists were purely thinking along the lines, is this an Australian that could be returned to an Australian family and repatriated for those reasons? That was actually a mistake. Like when you're investigating a crime like a bombing, small body parts are likely to be your offender. So eventually, when I did this post-mortem with Dr. Cook, we found 3 body parts which clearly looked as though they all belonged to each other. And of course, the only way you could tell that a foot belongs to a head is through DNA analysis. So, the DNA analysis was a very, very important part of creating an absolute black and white picture of what actually happened. And that body, I refer to it as body 006A, was actually the man who had actually gone in and suicided inside Paddy's bar. And that man, the police had a very strong idea who he was, so investigators were sent up into the country to interview his parents to prove who he was, and that's when it all unfolded that he wasn't who we thought he was somebody else. And then the DNA profile was later compared, and it turned out that there was another suicide bomber as well. So that ties it all in together as an act of terrorism rather than just a coincidental, vengeful attack by one person.
So this was a very long, complex investigation. What were some of the main challenges?
The challenges were that it was such a long, complicated investigation. Like, we talk about the Bali bombings, but I think I did 8 different bombings over 5 years. Each one was a nightmare. Each one you wish hadn't happened. Each one involved innocent people. Each one took you away from your home, took you away from your family. It just wears you down. Interestingly, the first one's the hardest. It's a bit like identifying the IRA, the IRA in Ireland. Once when you know who your offenders are, the rest of them sort of fit the mould. So every bombing after that was sort of, we know who did this. And it turned out that their master bomb maker, who was a man called Dr. Azahari, he had very typical ways of making things. Like he had a soldering technique that we could recognise in debris, and he did things that were a bit peculiar that a normal bomb maker would do. And after a while, we saw his signature of his behaviours appearing on all the other bombings. And the nature of the terrorism changed. Like in the first place, the offenders were actually able to get large quantities of explosives, but after the police put more and more pressure tracking them down, their bombs changed size and shape and became smaller. And in the end, they're using sort of lunch boxes that had sort of, the chlorate mixtures and powdered TNT and all sorts of funny things going on there, basically designed as backpack bombs. Yeah, so the nature of the bombing changed, but the offenders didn't, and it was just a very, very long, slow process to track them down. As far as I was concerned, one of the biggest problems for a forensic scientist is finding things that are out of context. And when you're operating in another country, everything's out of context. Like, I could go through your garbage bin and I'd recognise 90% of it or more. But if you go through a garbage bin, in Borneo, you come across things you haven't seen before, and it's very, very hard to see what's in context. Now, a classic example of this was that at one stage I was analysing parts from a bombing, and I came across some crystals. I analysed them, and much to my amazement, I found it was sugar. And sugar, well, that's a really interesting thing to use in explosives, because the IRA were using sugar instead of diesel in order to stop sniffer dogs from detecting their explosives. So I was, in my mind, thinking there might be some link between Jamaah Islamiyah and the IRA or whatever it might be. But about 3 or 4 days later, I was in the Indonesian laboratory, and I realised that, they were so poor there, they were actually reusing brown paper bags that had gula written on the outside. Well, gula meant nothing to me, but it's actually Bahasa for the word sugar. So they were reusing brown paper sugar bags to collect up their debris from bomb scenes, and I was analysing it and finding sugar. So, you have these sort of red herrings appearing left, right and centre all the way through the investigation, and you go from moments of excitement, extreme interest, to sort of deflation. I think, means nothing.
How did the Bali bombing investigation affect you personally?
Personally, it was awful. I certainly wish it never happened, because it had a toll on my family. It certainly had a toll on me. I still get upset about it. Like, I'm an old man now, and I'm a grandfather, and I see the joy that I'm having still to this day is fantastic, and that has been taken away from all these people. 202 people, had their lives stolen from them, were murdered, and just the tragedy. I'm fine until I think about the relatives or parents of a lot of those victims. I think it's just absolutely it's just the most awful thing, and I just wish it never had happened.
So, David, clearly and understandably, it remains a very upsetting experience to reflect on, but there was really significant scientific work done by you and others. And quite soon after the bombing, there was an attempt by an Australian filmmaker to make a film about this. And can you tell us about your experiences there?
Yeah, it's a funny story, really, because I was actually in Bali, staying in the same hotel, investigating a second wave of bombings in 2005. I saw people I recognised off TV as Hugo Weaving and Richard Roxburgh and some other people, and I was told that they're making a movie about this, and I was introduced to Hugo and Richard, and we had a nice time together. We went out and had a meal together and had a chat, and turned out they told me that Richard Roxburgh was going to be portraying me as some sort of geeky scientist. And he was looking at me in a leery sort of a way, which made me feel quite uncomfortable, because quite clearly what he was doing was actually trying to pick up my mannerisms to make his role playing a lot easier. Anyway, it turned out that they were in full swing of making this movie. I went down to the movie set. It was really quite incredible. They're doing a wonderful job, and it would have been a great movie, except what happened is that the governor of Bali, who was Made Pastika, who had been the senior detective for the Indonesian police at the time, he decided, for very good reasons, that such a movie would probably impact negatively on the tourism of people going to Bali. And my understanding is that the camera equipment was confiscated, and the movie, all plans had stopped, and they just couldn't proceed with it, which, from the point of view of the movie makers, was a terrible tragedy. But once again, seeing it from the perspective of the Indonesians, and certainly from the governor, he was actually protecting the lives and welfare of his people, which I think is a very reasonable thing to do.
You've written at least one scientific paper on your work in Bali, and given untold presentations to police and scientists. What are the key lessons from this investigation that you've been passing on to others?
Well, there's many, Liz, and one of them, I think, is that it's really important to be a generalist. Like, I was over there analysing samples for explosive residues most of the time. That's primarily what my role was. But in fact, key evidence turned out to be recovering engine numbers off vehicles. It turned out to be fibre evidence. It turned out to be, analysing glass and analysing paint samples and all sorts of things. So I think it's really important for, number one, for forensic scientists who go to these scenes to be sort of general analytical chemists. They're able to analyse everything, not just DNA or explosive residues alone, because that's, there's more to it than that. I think the other thing, which I think was a really important lesson to be learnt, was that getting samples soon, quickly, is really important. The sooner you get your sample, the better chance you're getting a good analysis from it is, and having a mobile laboratory, setting people up with instruments, portable instruments at the scene quickly is beneficial to the investigators. And I think that also international collaborations are really important. Like, I've had some people criticise me because I sent samples to 4 different laboratories saying, well, what happens if one comes up with the wrong answer? Well, if somebody comes up with a different answer, then that's something that needs to be explained. I think as a scientist, it's really important to canvass all possibilities. And the last thing I want to say is that in this investigation, it involved a whole team of people. It wasn't me. It was a whole team of people. My team, especially, was a really diverse group. It was gender equal. I had people from different cultures in my team, different races. They looked very different. So when we had Australian Federal Police turning up in Indonesia, the stereotype of an Australian was broken very quickly. Like, I look like I'm a Caucasian, old man. But one of my colleagues was Chinese. Another one was from Kenya. When you have a diverse team gives you a broad range of alternatives when you're actually exploring the unknown. And the greater the range of diversity, or greater the number of alternatives, gives you the better quality answer, gives you the best quality answer. So having as much diversity within your team is really important.
Oh, thanks. That's a really great answer. Now, thanks so much, David, for coming in. It's been fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Liz.
Crime Insiders Forensics is hosted by me, Liz Porter. It's produced by Holly Mitchell, Dan Mullins and Jade Murray. Sound design is by Link Kelly. This podcast is produced on Wurundjeri and Gadigal lands. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations listeners.